Right now, our about component and our about user components have references to this class of user and this array of users. It makes sense that we would define both of these in different places that could be exported and imported into the various routes and components that needed them. Additionally, a users array wouldn't really come from an array that we hard-coded in. It would come from something like a server or an API that we would get externally from our application. This is where a user service comes in, and that will be the place that we're going to use to connect to all of our external data. This way, we would have one service, a user service, that will get us all the users, or save users, or get a single user, and do all of those functions for us. Let's refactor this now to make it a little bit cleaner. Create a new folder, and we'll call this shared, since these parts of our application are going to be used in multiple locations. Right now, we're only using users in the about user and about components, but eventually when we build out the dashboard side of things, we'll also need to grab users there as well. We'll create two folders in here, one called models and another called services. Inside of models, we'll create a user.ts, which will be the user class that we have. And let's go grab that from one of these components. That's good there. And user services will create a user.service.ts. To create an Angular 2 service, we're going to import something called an injectable, which is a decorator that we use to define services in Angular 2. And that comes from the Angular core. We'll call this decorator now, injectable, and we'll leave it blank since we don't need to define anything in there for our current user service. We'll export the class user service. And here we'll have two functions, one for getting all users and one for find a specific user. Let's go grab that array of users out of here. And we'll paste that at the top here. Notice we're using this user class here, so we need to import that. So we'll import user from, and we'll back out, go into the models folder, user, and now we have access to that user model again. One thing we would like to change really quickly is right now we have a users array, which just returns an array of users. If we were to go get information out from an API or a server, it would make sense that we would return a promise instead of just a blank array. So let's change this out to users promise. And instead of the user type, we're going to return a promise of type user. And now let's do a promise.resolve. And close that. Now we're returning a promise and resolving it with the data in our users array. Now I don't want to get into too much detail. That doesn't really have to do too much with routing, but when we get into services and external data, you'd usually return data as a promise or as an observable. In this case, we're going to mimic a promise so that our other parts of our application can treat it like it would for real data. Now we need the get users, and we'll just return the user's promise that we have. And also we'll need to get a specific user where we pass in a username. We're going to define a user. We'll let user equal to user's promise, and we'll go through that. Then we have the users, and we'll loop through that. We're going to return users.find the user. And just like we did in the about user component, we're going to return the user.username that matches our username. And finally, we'll return that user. Now that's quite a bit of code to write. Let's try to simplify that a little bit more. We'll do return users promise dot then users, and we can shorthand this. Instead of doing that whole bracket and expanding it out, we can do users.find user where the user.username is equal to the username. And the way ES6 does this is that if you just use the arrow function and throw something right after the arrow function, it's an automatic return here. I think that will do it for our user service. Let's go and refactor our about component and our about user components to use these services. The first thing we need to do is import the user. And the user service. We are already using the user model correctly. Right here, we're using it the same exact way we did before. But right now, we don't have this users array anymore. We're going to get our users out of that service. So delete that. And then down here in our constructor, we're going to instantiate a new private service. And I'm just calling it service here since it's the only service we have in this class. You can also call it user service. But we'll pass in user service here. And now we have access to that user service. We'll use ng-on-init. We'll use the function that we just created in the user service. We'll do this.getUsers. Then, and we get the users back, and we'll pass that into this.users is equal to users. And we missed the word service here. All right, so that will be good enough to get all of the users from our service. Now this component in this class is not worried about having a users array inside of it. It delegates all of that grabbing information stuff to the service. In that way, this class is only worried about showing users. We get a good separation of concerns there. We'll do the same thing for the about user component. Copy these two and paste that down here. We have a private route in the constructor. We'll do the same and grab service is equal to the user service. And then on init, instead of doing this.user equals users.find, we don't have that users array anymore. We're going to do this.service.getUser, and we'll pass in the username that we have. Then user, and we'll break this out. We'll do this.user is equal to user. Now these three lines are irrelevant to us, and we have a simple way to get our user. An even simpler way is to simplify this. Into one line. One thing I'm noticing we missed here is make sure that this is a colon user. That way we know that this has to be a user class. This is looking good for our about user component. All right, looks like we're showing a problem for this user model, and that's because we didn't remove the stuff that defined it as well. So we'll remove all this boilerplate code, and our about user component is that much simpler. One thing I'm remembering we missed out of the about component is we implemented ng-on-init. So while it's not totally necessary, we're going to implement the interface as well. And we'll grab that out of the Angular core. So while it's not totally necessary, it's a good practice to have the interface. One goal with TypeScript is to have self-documenting code, and by implementing the interface, we know that we're going to use ng-on-init. You can see that if we delete ng-on-init, we're going to throw an error for about component since we haven't implemented an ng-on-init function. The very last thing we need to do, we created a brand new user service. We need to pass that into the app module so that it knows how to use it. Now we don't have the section for services. We'll add providers here, which is what a service is a provider, and we'll do user service. Now our application should function and act just like it did before, but we now have a simple way to use a service to get all of the information about users. About page, click through to a username, and everything is working the exact same way. That might not seem like a lot right now, but when we move into getting users in different locations, it will be a really big help that we have a user service that is separate from any components.